A few days ago, I went camping with my dog Lutz up in the mountains in my hometown. While camping, we encountered something strange and terrifying. Let me just say that I'm not a good writer. This story might be long, but please listen to the end, and I will answer any questions on this thread. The place I camped is in Ishikawa. I was only camping for one night. The campsite is quite famous for its beauty, which usually meant that the place was busy, but it had rained heavily the day before I was set to camp, so there was no other tents pitched up and no cars in the parking lot. The park ranger at the gate let me know that I would be camping alone. There was this U-shaped concrete construction all the campers used to build a fire, kind of a windbreaker. After a while, I was able to get a little fire going, and I went about preparing dinner. I made a curry and ate it in my mess tin, and I gave Lutz some canned dog food. I'm 18 years old, and I'll be 19 this year. But I've been camping for years. All my friends have left town for university. I didn't have anyone to go with, so I brought my dog along. By the way, Lutz is a German Shepherd. Rain began to fall quite heavily, so Lutz and I hurried into the tent. It was a 3-man tent, so Lutz and I were very comfortable, and we had plenty of room. I hung my LED lantern inside the tent. It illuminated the whole tent, and it worked out great. The park ranger told me that there may be a bear in the area when I called to make a reservation. I decided to bring my airsoft gun for protection. I was stroking Lutz while reading a book in my tent. It was about 10 p.m. The rain was still falling, and I was enjoying the sound it made on the roof of the tent. I felt as if I could sleep at any moment. Just as I was reaching to turn the lantern out, I heard this mewing sound coming from outside. It sounded cat-like. It's hard to describe. It wasn't really like a meow as such. It was more like a cry. I guess there are people out there who must know what I'm trying to describe. I thought perhaps it was like a mating call or something like that. I thought it was a cat because I'm used to hearing them in the streets at night. I was a bit suspicious since I didn't imagine there would be domestic cats in the mountains. I was pretty far into the mountains and there was no street noise. I've been camping on this site since I was a boy and I've never seen a cat, let alone heard one. It played on my mind. I wondered if a cat had gotten lost out there in the rain. So I went out with Lutz to have a look. I had set my tent up in the biggest campsite area since I was the only one there. I heard the crying coming from another one of the camping areas. It was pitch black outside, so I took my lantern from the tent. Lutz and I went in the direction of the sound. Suddenly, Lutz began to growl. He's not the kind of dog that growls. He's the type to let a stranger stroke him. Because he so seldom growls, it startled me. It's pretty creepy. My eyes eventually grew accustomed to the darkness. I was able to see the whole plaza area around us. It was like a square. I noticed weeds growing through the wet concrete areas of the kids' playground. Then I saw it. In the group campfire area, there was something strange. It was about the size of a sleeping bag, and it looked like a giant caterpillar. I didn't know what I was looking at. I thought for some reason it was a bear cub because I hadn't seen one before. I had only seen wild deer in this area. There was no doubt that this thing was emitting the weird crying sound. Rain continued to fall, pitter-pattering in the puddles on the concrete. Even though I was frightened, wanted to go in for a closer look, I was very cautious. I had never seen anything quite like this thing before. This thing was flopping up and down like a fish. Every time it did this odd movement, it was making that strange noise. Lutz was still growling as we drew closer. We were about 5 meters away, and I could see it clearly now. It was like a sleeping bag covered in thick hair. No, not hair, but thick spines like that of a porcupine. It was like an insect, but the size of a mammal. It was facing away from us as we approached, but now it was alerted to our presence. It started to turn around, and I froze in my tracks. It turned what I guessed was its face towards us. Long, tactile, antenna-like prongs twitched and sensed the air. And at the end of these stalks were eyeballs. It was like a snail. I'm no artist, but this is a quick sketch of what it looked like. It wasn't as cute as it looks here, I can tell you. And the hole on its face isn't a nose. Those 3 prongs are what I guess are its tactile sensors. Below its face was a thick, beard-like mass of hair. I didn't mean one of the eyes to come out so strange, I just wanted to show that they were staring at me. No longer than a couple of seconds must have passed, but it felt like an eternity to me. All the sound in the world drained away. At this point, Lutz bit and gripped the cuff of my trousers and began trying to pull me back. I snapped out of it. Lutz and I retreated back to our tent for the time being. We managed to get away safely, but I could still hear that crying noise. I was confused and I went into protection mode. I ran to get the airsoft gun from my tent. Lutz stopped growling. For what reason, I do not know. Perhaps it was to not let that thing know where we were. He stood on guard at the tent entrance. It was only a crappy airsoft gun, but to have any kind of weapon in my hand made me feel reassured. I was alert and standing guard. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't hear that crying sound, just the rain. I was sweating, but thinking a bit clearer now, and I felt a bit safer. I decided to call the park ranger I had spoke to at the gate. I had good signal and a lot of battery left. I knew that the ranger lived either on site or very close to the camping site. The only problem was that I couldn't leave. It was now about 11 p.m. The ranger was still supposed to be on duty, but no matter how many times I called, he didn't pick up. Lutz stood still, silently guarding the entrance of the tent. We still hadn't heard the crying again, but I was still covered in goosebumps. It was the first time in a long time that I had gotten goosebumps. Something was approaching our tent. It sounded like something was crawling or slithering over the weeds. There was no doubt in my mind that that thing was heading towards the tent. I wanted to turn off the electric lantern, but that would mean plunging Lutz and I into the darkness, and I was not prepared to do that. Rain was still falling. I could hear it against the roof of the tent. I could hear that crawling, slithering sound louder now. I guessed that it was right in front of the tent. Still, Lutz didn't growl or bark. He was just standing guard. I aimed my gun at the entrance. I heard something right outside there. It sounded like a child's voice. I couldn't be sure if it was male or female. I had no idea what the voice was saying. I was getting stressed out by the situation. It was at this point that Lutz leapt at something at the entrance of the tent. A howl of agony was heard. I ran outside to Lutz's aid. Lutz was biting that caterpillar-like creature I saw at the plaza. It was flopping around in the wet grass, presumably screaming in pain. I grabbed Lutz by his collar and shouted at him to follow me. We ran as fast as we could towards the ranger's hut. We were running in the darkness, and I checked if Lutz was back there following me by calling his name. He replied with a bark each time, amidst the distant rumble of thunder. Rain lashed us. My coat was saturated, and my hair was slick to my skin. With the lantern in my right hand and my airsoft gun in my left, we ran, solely focused on getting to the ranger's hut. I also had a knife tucked into my belt line. It wasn't easy going running through the forest in the dark with only a lantern as a light source. The campsite was pretty well maintained, but I wasn't running on concrete anymore. I was running on the wet, slippery grass. I didn't have time to take any precautions while running. I was too scared. I'd tripped magnificently on a tree root. I went flying through the air, down a small grass verge, and somehow managed to hold on to the lantern and my gun. But I smashed my head pretty badly. My field of vision was all blurry, and I was disorientated. Lutz was whining and growling in my direction from above. My body wouldn't move. I thought for a second that I had really injured myself. I focused on Lutz's barking, and eventually my vision came back to me. I was able to get up. I don't know how long I was down there for. As I was climbing back up, I could hear Lutz barking like mad. I instantly became more anxious and worried for him. I was climbing as fast as I possibly could, yet I was still groggy. When I managed to clamber back up to him, that thing was back. It was squaring off with Lutz and hissing at him. Lutz was standing guard at the point where I fell. I calmly walked in front of Lutz and shot the thing in what I guessed was its face. I knew that my air gun wasn't the most powerful, but I needed to do something to get some distance between us and that thing. I didn't want Lutz in any more danger. That thing made a sound that I cannot express in written words. It was otherworldly. Lutz and I started running again, towards the ranger's hut. I was soaking wet with the rain from the incessant downpour, aching from my fall and caked in mud, also not truly knowing the extent of my injuries. I was just running on pure adrenaline. I saw the lodge up ahead, and we slowed. We were finally back to the ranger's hut. The door was locked, but the lights were on. I banged on the door with all my might. A thought crossed my mind that the ranger wasn't going to open the door, but after a while he finally came and unlocked the door and let Lutz and I in. The ranger shut the door, and we went over to sit down. I shouted at him to lock the door. The ranger stared at me with concern. I was still panting from the run. He led us to the lounge and passed me a couple of towels. While I dried myself and Lutz off, I explained what had happened. He gave me some coffee, and it helped calm my nerves. I checked Lutz for wounds, but I was glad to not find any trace of injury. He listened to my story without prejudice. When I mentioned that thing, I saw his face turn slightly pale. When my story was finished, the park ranger stood up, walked over to a corner in the lounge, and unlocked and removed some chains from a cabinet. He then took out a large hunting rifle. He then went about the lodge checking if all the doors and windows were locked. He returned a few moments later with some firewood and lit the fireplace. He then came and sat opposite me. With a stern look on his face, he had the hunting rifle resting across his knees. He started to talk. He seemed to know something about the creature I had seen. He said that he heard it from other campers and hikers, that they had seen something similar eating an antelope. The ranger said he hadn't seen it himself, but the other customers had. They said it was a huge, slug-like creature. He had even heard this from his family ancestors who lived in this region their whole lives. They spoke of a creature that lived in the mountains. Some believed that it was a god. He said that people had reported seeing it, but no one had reported it chasing or attacking them. He didn't seem the type to believe in such things, but I guess my appearance and the worry on my face must have convinced him to consider it. The park ranger allowed me and Lutz to stay the night in the common room. We settled down for the night. I drifted off to sleep almost instantly, and woke later to the ranger tapping on my shoulder. I guessed that it was about 2 a.m. I heard that horrible crying sound coming from outside. I saw Lutz had adopted his guard stance once again. Neither the park ranger nor I wanted to check outside. To begin with, we lit the fire. It must have gone out while we were sleeping. In the glow of the fire, the park ranger revealed to me that his manager had heard a story about something eating a person out there. I was surprised by this sudden revelation. He looked down at the ground and said something I didn't understand, but I grasped the nuance of what he was trying to say. I researched it before writing this, and it was an archaic regional phrase which meant, those poor people. Although my family and I were all born in Ishikawa, it was a phrase that I hadn't heard before. Outside was dark, one of the darkest nights I had ever seen. I could hear that crying sound out there. It sounded like it was right by the door. At that moment we heard some muffled banging against the door. It rumbled on like a tremor. The banging continued, although it was briefly interrupted by that piercing cry. The driving rain sounded as if it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. It was such a strange collection of noises. The park ranger readied his hunting gun and aimed it at the wooden door. I took the hint and aimed my airsoft gun at the door too. Lutz stood on guard beside me. I noticed his gun had 2 barrels. The park ranger called out, "Who's out there?" I could tell he was nervous. The banging stopped. The crying stopped. All that could be heard was the driving rain. This eerie silence lasted for about 3 minutes. The park ranger and I exchanged glances, and we thought we were going to be safe. This time, the banging was louder. It was like a battering ram or something throwing itself into the door. The park ranger pulled the trigger of his gun. The noise was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. It was so piercing. The recoil jarred his body. The door had lots of tiny holes in it. He unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open, looking terrified as he did so. There was nothing out there, save for a few of that creature's long, spiky needle hairs. We decided to put a piece of firewood against the door to cover the hole of the gunshot. We then hunkered down by the fire and waited until morning came. Nothing further happened that night. We watched the sun rise without incident. It was the longest night of my life. We had been kept in such a total state of readiness that we were completely exhausted. The park ranger put in a call to the local hunting club, and about 2 hours later 3 men arrived, aged between 50 and 60 years old. So the 5 of us, and Lutz, headed towards my campsite. All of my things were in disarray, and there was more of those long needle-like hairs. We returned to the park ranger's cabin and began to fill in the men from the hunting club, the events from last night. Even though the men from the hunting club hadn't seen the creature in question, they had heard the local legend. That happened yesterday. I'm now at home. Lutz's mouth looks pretty bad, so I've taken him to a vet. He's staying overnight since his condition is not great. I'm so worried about him. I got a ride home with one of the older men from the hunting club. He said that he heard many stories about the thing I saw in the mountains, and there were many names for it. Some said it was the god of the mountains, a protector of the forests. Another story he mentioned was that the creature was the result of a deformed child interacting with a spirit of the forest. Before he dropped me off, he asked for my phone number to keep in touch. He had some ideas of going to a shrine together. Here's a Lutz update. He's still with the vets. They tell me that he's not eating anything, but this baby food looking dog food. He's not moving much either. Not having Lutz here, after he risked his life for me, is heartbreaking. I keep staring at his basket and wondering how he is. The vet told me that they will have to wait and see. Here's a photo of him. I will post an update on Tuesday or Wednesday. I went to the vets on Tuesday. It looks like I'll be getting Lutz home for Monday. I was so relieved. I've been on a total high all day. On Wednesday I got a call from the hunter. He and the park ranger decided to go to the temple to speak with a priest, and I decided to join them. I will let you know what happens with that. I thought we would meet a stereotypical looking monk, but the priest looked to be in his 30s. The hunter, the park ranger, and I sat across the desk from the priest. We told him our story, and he listened without prejudice, and what appeared to be genuine interest, right to the end. The hunter chipped in with the additional stories he had from his buddies about the creature. The priest knew the creature we spoke of. He said that there were numerous accounts handed down through the town's history and folklore. I was a bit confused and bewildered. Did everyone in the town know about this thing? When we had finished our stories, he told us an account he had heard from his predecessor. He said that the creature was fueled by the spirit of a deformed child who was led to the mountains and left to die by his parents. The second account stated that it was a large hornworm, and an ancient practice was to present this giant hornworm, a newborn child, as an offering. I won't go into the details I heard, as they were gross. It was disgusting. I didn't think the thing looked that much like a hornworm, though. I thought it looked more like a slug. Seems this cryptid has some sort of fame in this town. I decided to keep in touch with the priest, and he would ask regularly how Lutz and I were doing. He tried to provide more theories about the creature too. He said he heard a story from his grandfather. In ancient times, there was a village on the mountains. The inhabitants of the village lived their lives without interaction from outsiders until they were discovered. The inhabitants of the mountain village looked very physically different from the people who found them. They were described as being fantastically grotesque, especially the children. They were persecuted for their looks and their beliefs. These mountainers believed in rebirth and reincarnation. Fearing the outsiders had come to change their way of life, the mountain villagers chose some children to become gods to protect them via rebirth. When the outsiders heard about this, they tried to wipe out the mountain villagers and their history. The remaining living ones were forced to live in the mountains in secret. In this town there is a common nursery rhyme about the importance of not seeking revenge on others. He updated me at another point, saying that some hikers had gone missing, and another group of campers from the site I stayed at reported another sighting of the creature. I tried to search the campsite's webpage, but it's been deleted. Maybe that's for the best. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll update if anything else happens.